Let's begin. I think I have now heard from everybody on papers. I haven't fully gotten back to everybody, but anybody I heard from yesterday, you'll hear from me by the end of the day today. Just make sure this is off. So we are near the end. I hope everybody's doing relatively well. I know this is crunch time for you guys. A couple of updates, and then I'll sort of tell you where we are and what the plan is for the next 2 weeks. So the wiki is up there. I don't know if anybody's using the book for research purposes or not. I haven't investigated whether there's a way of tracking that. I hope you are, and I think the search function's going to just get better. I think it has gotten better. It seems to be working. There are a couple of things I should point out that may be a bit non-obvious because this is such a new sort of experiment in terms of taking a published text and putting it on a wiki. It is modifiable like any other wiki. So you can go in there, add, change the text of the book, subtract from it, take new information. You should not feel restricted in doing that. So it is a wiki like any other wiki, which makes this a very interesting experiment. And from a personal standpoint, I have to say, it's kind of weird to take something that you worked pretty hard on for 2 years and just put it out there and say people can do with it whatever they want to do with it. But I think it is the right thing. There is a second edition. There is a third edition coming. So, you know, it may be a bit, it may feel a bit odd, but it's definitely the right thing. The other totally optional piece is we are creating a wiki space so that if you want to put your papers up on a wiki, on the course wiki for posterity or otherwise, it will be there and available to you. It's totally optional. It's obviously got nothing to do with your grade, and I will actually make sure that it doesn't go up. You'll be able to put it up whenever you want, and I think the suggestion is put it up, if you're going to do that, put it up as soon as possible, because if you wait till next semester, you might never get to it. But I'll make sure that nothing actually appears on the wiki and that I don't know anything about what's there or what isn't there until after marks are posted. So that's probably the right way of dealing with that. But that's also something that's an interesting part of the experiment. The open badges stuff, which we haven't talked about quite consciously on my part. I wasn't trying to overly encourage it. It just kind of a fun thing that happened. It did yield interesting results. If you go to the website, you'll see an infographic that the open badges people prepared. And there is going to be a survey that's voluntary, trying to convince one of our game distributors to provide a couple of prizes so that there'll be a random draw for a number of games, let's say, or hopefully a number of games for those who fill out the survey. But even without that, I hope everyone will fill out the survey. More to come on Oculus. Still waiting for the video with the audio because I haven't actually seen what's been described as my funky dance moves, and I look forward to seeing that. Some wonderful posts up on the website, and I guess I don't want to call it a surprise because it's not entirely that, but I say it is a bit surprising that people can see its pedagogical potential and that that's as clear as it seems to be. It's still potential, and there are all sorts of issues. I'm planning on writing a sort of a longish post on what the potential is, what the problems are. The biggest problems that I see are twofold. One, from a student perspective, whether it's a crutch or not, you need to keep notes. You often don't need to keep as many notes as you do, but people feel like they need to keep notes. And so there needs to be some modality within Oculus that allows you to do that. And do that accurately, and there should even be more than that. There should be a way for you to keep, since you're doing this, there should be a way of keeping placeholders, right? And in fact, this should be true of taping this very course. You should have some ability that you can mark something, especially for papers, as I'm speaking, right? You should be able to notate this, and 20 years from now, that'll be figured out so that you can notate this, and that when the video is posted on the website, your notations appear on your version of the video. Well, the Oculus, in theory, could get us closer to that quickly, but I just don't see students living without some sort of note-taking, marking capability. And I actually, sometimes it's a crutch, but I actually think it's important. Weirdly enough, it's more important in a course like this where you're working on a paper and you want to, and something is said in the class, either by me or by one of your colleagues, that twigs an idea. And right now you'd be writing that out or putting it on your computer. So I think that's one part. The other part, from my perspective, there is an enormous amount, and you know this from doing your moots, for example, of feedback that you get in a live environment, even if nobody's saying anything. And you just don't have that in the, I can't read faces in a virtual environment. And that capability will come, but to really effectively teach a class, unless you have, it was fine to do what we did last week because there was a live class in front of me, and then there were the Oculus people, and I more or less, sorry to say, didn't think about the Oculus people. I knew you were there, but I didn't key on you because there was no real feedback that I could get. So those feedback mechanisms are critical to real teaching. So cool experiment, shows the potential for learning because people did feel immersed. They felt in some ways even more focused from what I read than they do in a classroom that has more diversions because you kind of have nowhere else to go with the headset on. So that's really good news, but there's, I think, feedback loops that have to be built in for it to be the pedagogic experience that it can be. Any feedback from those who did it or those who didn't do it, or anybody want to say anything? There's great comments on the website, but just want to give people an opportunity if there are any observations. Okay, I think I'm not sure I can totally do this fairly, but I'll speak for the people in the class. It didn't really, I don't think, create any disruption that there was another parallel class going on. So from that wasn't a concern. Oh, please.
One little interesting thing was we could hear the doors so loud. We could hear people going in and out and like look around in the first and be surprised when there was no one.
There's going to be a lot, to do this properly, there's going to be a lot of tweaking. But the real potential is if someone's sick, or the other potential is to have a class, especially at a graduate level. Why should you be at a graduate level, especially tied to a physical classroom, a physical location? You're all adults. You're all, especially in law school or in graduate school, really responsible for yourselves. And if we can solve in 10 years the feedback loops, so that they feel really, so that you feel really present to me and I feel really present to you, then I think there's an enormous amount of good that can be done, and a lot of social good that can be done as well. Because part of the problem with education, for large parts of the world, is just getting to it. So, it was we weren't the first to do it. We may have been the first. We certainly are the first in the law school. May have been among the first at UBC to do it. But it was more promising and more interesting than I thought it would be. That said, none of us really knew what to expect. So we're on the final leg of the journey, and we're trying to reconcile. I guess I'm going to try and take you through some possible ways of reconciling what we've done. And it's interesting because today I'm going to essentially be talking more or less about software and creativity and reconciling that part of it, and going all the way up to, but not really, doing the full-on post-structuralist reconciliation. That will be the final chapter next week. But I also realized that it was partially the Oculus that made me realize it, and partially some things Mia Consalvo said that twigged further thoughts, that the connecting piece, not that there's any great new insight here, but that the connecting piece is largely about platforms, and that we have to, somewhere in here, when we're doing our conciliation, talk about platforms, talk about connectivity, talk about net neutrality, and bring in the contractual piece into that. And so all of that is what I'm leaving as the second part of the conciliation next week. And I think it lives actually quite well with the post-structuralist stuff that also has to be finished. So today's I don't want to say fully conventional, but it has it only goes so far, and hopefully the really new and significantly interesting stuff will finish the course. So two cases that have loomed large, and I would say Davidson has loomed larger, but everybody knows about the Schwarzenegger case and Brown versus ESA. And I want to take those seemingly disparate cases and see if we can find a common denominator, and then use that as a jumping off point to the rest. So I'm starting to have to go over here, but Brown, as you will recall, is a First Amendment case that has to do with a California statute that regulated the sale of video games to minors. And the question in the U.S. Supreme Court was constitutionality. And I just realized we weren't at the critical part. This is... Sorry. Oh, there we go. So, the Blizzard case, the Orc case, is the BattleNet case. And what I'll just bring to your attention is something I mentioned before, but the US IP law teachers were unsuccessful in their arguments, and they wanted Blizzard's EULA end-user license agreement to be preempted by copyright law, and they failed. And this is essentially the case that you can blame for contract law being seen as dominant over copyright law. They also argued that the court should enforce the doctrine of copyright misuse against Blizzard, and the court did not do so. And what the law professors were trying to do was preserve the application of fair use to reverse engineering. Now, Schwarzenegger case overtly was about a California statute that defined a violent video game, meaning a video game in which a range of options available to a player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being. And goes on and on. The Schwarzenegger case, the court goes to correlation, not causation, and basically says the research does not prove that violent video games create sufficient danger to society, and doesn't demonstrate a causal link between minors playing games and actual psychological or neurological harm. Therefore, freedom of speech in the First Amendment of the American Constitution is invoked, and the statute is barred. The court looks at the history of literature and points out what you know, and that is that the violence and the things that are depicted in video games have always been depicted in literature from the Bible onwards in one way or another. And so I won't take away the punchline because I'm going to play you a little bit of tape. And then here is where there were two views of the court. And particularly interesting in the week after the Oculus experiment, for those of you who use the Oculus, to think about this one. So Scalia, for the majority of the court said interactivity doesn't really present a special problem. It doesn't really create a distinction from the rest of literature and the rest of film in terms of the impact of the violence. And as for the argument that video games enable participation in the violent action, that seems to us more of a matter of degree than of kind. Justice Alito takes a different perspective. He concurred in the result, but on this, his view was that when it comes to video games, there is certainly a reasonable basis for thinking that the experience of playing a video game may be quite different from the experience of reading a book, listening to a radio broadcast, or viewing a movie. And if this is so, then at least for some minors, the effects of playing violent video games may also be quite different. The court acts prematurely in dismissing this possibility out of hand. There's lots of research in this area, and I think all we can safely say is that as games get more immersive, as Oculus becomes the norm, or things like Oculus become the norm, there will be more testing and more research, and we'll see. I don't actually expect that causality will be established in this way, but you can't discount the possibility. Now, this is, I thought this slide was earlier. It is actually in the right place and where it should be. So I want to play you two clips. And I want to make sure that I have this right. So this is audio from Blizzard and BNETD. And I'm going to play you 3240 to 3305.
How do you pronounce it?
My name is Paul Graywall, Your Honor. I represent the appellants in this action.
That sounds better. The way I pronounced it made it sound like cereal.
So this is in Court of Appeal.
Court.
Yeah, sorry.
Although the parties have addressed many spend this kind of resources to invent new games, knowing that they'd be pirated, but in some way
this is counsel for Blizzard.
By people wanting authentic games so they could play online, advertising, and so forth. This case does not involve new creation. There may be a case that does. This isn't it. This case, as Judge Shaw found, involves tinkering and piracy. The DMCA and...
Okay. So remember the facts here. This is Blizzard comes up with BattleNet. BattleNet doesn't work so well, and a group of fans get together, reverse engineer Blizzard's BattleNet, take out the ads that Blizzard included in BattleNet, create a better, I don't think anyone disputed, a better, more useful tool, at least at the initial time, put it out for free on the net, and you heard Blizzard's counsel say, this case does not involve new creation. There may be a case that does, this isn't it. Excuse me? So this modification is not a new creation, which sort of begs the question of what exactly it is and what is your definition of a new creation. But what you're really hearing is how afraid Blizzard's counsel is that this is seen as a creative act. And by now you know why he would be afraid of that, because that brings in all sorts of fair use and freedom of speech arguments. So he needs to characterize it this way. And I can't speak, obviously, for the degree of technological knowledge of video games on the U.S. Court of Appeal in 2005, but I'm guessing it wasn't that great. And Blizzard succeeded. So now I want to play you excerpt from the U.S. Supreme Court in the Schwarzenegger case.
We'll hear argument first this morning in Case 08-1448, Schwarzenegger versus Entertainment Merchants Association. Mr. Morosini.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the Court. The California law at issue today before this Court differs from the New York law at issue in Ginsburg in only one respect. Where New York was concerned with minors' access to harmful sexual material outside the guidance of a parent, California is no less concerned with a minor's access to the deviant level of violence that is presented in a certain category of video games that can be no less harmful to the development of minors. When this Court in Ginsburg crafted a rule of law that permits states to regulate a minor's access to such material outside the presence of a parent, it did so for two fundamental reasons that are equally applicable this morning in this case. First, this rule permits parents' claim to authority in their own household to direct the upbringing and the development of their children. And secondly, this rule promotes the state's independent interest in helping parents protect the well-being of children in those instances when parents cannot be present. So this morning, California asked this Court to adopt a rule of law that permits states to restrict minors' ability to purchase deviant, violent video games that the legislature has determined can be harmful to the development.
What's a deviant, violent video game as opposed to normal violent video game?
Yes, Your Honor. Deviant would be departing from established norms.
And there are established norms of violence?
Well, I think if we look back...
I mean, some of the Grimm's fairy tales are quite grim, to tell you the truth.
Agreed, Your Honor. But the level of violence...
Are they okay? You going to ban them too?
Not at all, Your Honor.
What's the difference? I mean, if you are supposing a category of violent materials dangerous to children, then how do you cut it off with video games? What about films? What about comic books? Grimm's fairy tales? Why are video games special? Or does your principle extend to all deviant, violent materials in whatever form?
No, Your Honor. That's why I believe California incorporated the three prongs of the Miller Standard. So it's not just deviant violence. It's not just patently offensive violence. It's violence that meets all three of the terms set forth.
I think that misses Justice Ginsburg's question, which was, why just video games? Why not movies, for example, as well?
Sure, Your Honor. The California legislature was presented with substantial evidence that demonstrates that the interactive nature of violent video games, where the minor or the young adult is the aggressor, is the individual acting out this obscene level of violence, if you will, is especially harmful to minors.
Well, do you actually have studies that show that video games are more harmful to minors than movies are?
Well, in the record, Your Honor, I believe...
Okay. I'm going to take you a little bit further for a few seconds.
In some states just as violent that are not covered.
Well, Your Honor, I think a jury could be instructed with expert testimony, with video clips of gameplay, and to judge for themselves whether...
I'm not concerned about the jury judging. I'm concerned about the producer of the games who has to know what he has to do in order to comply with the law. And you're telling me, well, a jury can... Of course a jury can make up its mind, I'm sure. But a law that has criminal penalties has to be clear. And how is the manufacturer to know whether a particular violent game is covered or not?
Okay. I think you take the point. And the common denominator, and I want you to focus especially on the clip I just played you from Schwarzenegger. I'm concerned with the producer of the game. So who's the producer of the game? In the eyes of the court, and I'm not sure that they've done a post-structuralist analysis, the producer of the game is the creator of the game. And the common denominator between the two cases is the power of the creator. In Davidson, the court was led away from that point, and arguably for that reason didn't see it, and didn't see the group that created BNETD and the kids who created it as creators, and was expressly told not to see them that way. They were tinkerers. Interesting to know. We should tell everybody in the Faculty of Engineering that they are tinkerers and therefore not creators, and I'd like to hear their reaction. And it was expressly, the notion of the creator was expressly given a voice in the Schwarzenegger case through the producer. So the common denominator is creativity. The place we've gotten to where we've added something during the course is the suggestion that users/gamers are creators as well and fully qualify for that status and for that protection. And you can disagree with that because there are cogent arguments to draw distinctions, but it's at the very least a serious question. And it's a serious question that generally has not been given much voice in the law. Now, I'll show you over the rest of this what tools are available to us, and really I'll bring up again what the Supreme Court of Canada has laid a foundation for, because that's probably as far as we can responsibly go. So what's the issue with creativity? It's the notion of being chilled. It's the notion that we're going to impede creators. We're going to prevent them from creating, and it's very important. I won't say terribly important. It's very important in a society for people to be creative. So it's also perhaps an open question to some. On that, I really have very little doubt. So what's the role of law in all of this? And I think for that question, again, the Blizzard case and the Schwarzenegger case are useful examples, because you're not going to like everything about each of those cases. And there are things about Schwarzenegger where even if you like the result, there are things that are very uncomfortable. And I hope that I've pointed that out. And if you need a focus for that, go to how far the new technology can take us, how immersive it can be, go to some of the brain games things we've talked about. And, if the findings are as absolute as Scalia is, even I get uncomfortable at that level. There's a lot we don't yet know. So what's the role of law in all of this? And I've talked about some of it, but I want to focus a little bit for a few minutes. Law can't keep up. And there are victims of that, and Aaron Schwartz was definitely one. What are we trying to do? And this is sort of, to me, the tightrope that we walk. And the tightrope we walk is we're trying to come up with principles that are general in application, but that are going to be personal to every single person that are subject to those principles. And again, without going all post-structuralist on you, that's a really, really, really difficult thing that we're trying to achieve. That lawyers, legislators, legal academics, and judges have to deal with. So you've seen this before, but I'm going to try and expound on it a little bit more. Consider the possibility that communications technologies affect, impact, and shape the law. Because they do. And that's what I'll try and demonstrate. So this puts the debate around video games, which is a communications technology, in a very, very interesting place. Because it's, in effect, going to influence its own outcomes. And I don't know that there's much we can do about that, but I'm just going to give you the theory. So, put another way, communications tools iteratively alter and shape how and what we communicate, and as a result, how we formulate ethical and legal frameworks. That's actually really, really obvious. I'll try and make it more obvious. And add to this that law itself can be an outcome of two things. It can be an outcome of order, or it can be an outcome of justice. And it's really an and/or, because you're not going to find societies or governments saying that we only care about order. They're going to look for more harmony between their concept of justice and their concept of order. But when you talk about justice as opposed to law, it's only partially inspired by order. There is a social contract aspect to it, for sure. But more often, justice and the notion of justice is inspired by human potential, by living as fully as we can. And, that's, I probably should give you a few more sites. But this is a version of what you've seen before. I've actually settled fully on the answer to virtual reality and what are the concepts that we're dealing with. So on your left-hand side, you will see technology concepts, and on the right-hand side, sort of means of law and what those technological realities brought into the world and how they may have affected definitions of justice and therefore notions of law. But I'm going to go further this time because this I don't think I did do before. I just want to try and hammer home the point. So the first is you've got the pre-literate stage. Justice is retribution. If you've read about this, you'll actually realize that justice as retribution was a step forward. And it really was. The notion was actually a step forward in humanity, because before that, there was no notion of why you could hurt a fellow human being. It was just power and need, and the notion that you could damage someone as retribution actually narrowed violence. So think about that. We look at this and we think it's barbaric because of the arrow of time. But at the time this notion was introduced, it was anything but barbaric. It was downright progressive. And, you know, everyone can disagree on, these are totally my interpretations. I looked for a long time for, you know, my original notion was somebody will have done a really good history of the stages of law, and somebody will have done a really good history on the stages of communication, and I don't have to do any work. I just put them together. They'll match up perfectly, et cetera, et cetera. Nobody's done a really good piece on the stages of law that I could find, and nobody's done a really good piece on the stages of communications. You find bits and pieces. So this is very imperfect and unfortunately more original than I would like it to be. Writing instruments come along, and what do we get? We get contracts, we get deals, we get notions of compensation. And the notion of justice changes to that. Printing press comes along. This one's pretty obvious, and this one's dealt with a lot in the law school. You get the printing press, and you get the notion of rights. So this is the one I want you to focus on if you want an easy understanding of the concept that I'm trying to convince you of. And that is, there you have the technology, and the technology defines the definition of justice that's going to prevail. You get the printing press changes the world, and part of how the world changes is that its legal concepts arising from its concepts of justice change. And the printing press leads to manifestos of rights, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, all of these things. You got the printing press, and suddenly people started talking about rights, from Martin Luther onwards. Interesting. Changed our world. Next phase, mass media. So what happens? What happens to justice, our concepts of justice? Suddenly, in the mass media world, we're looking for facts. We're looking for evidence. Actually affected us as lawyers. You know, suddenly discoveries became way bigger and way more detailed. They're becoming even more detailed now because of big data, but the real shift, I would argue, the shift in the zeitgeist came from mass media, cases stopped being small. They started becoming big. And in a mass media world, evidence and facts became important to notions of truth and justice. That's what media does. It reports on stuff. Think of Vietnam. Huge debates on what are the facts, what's the evidence, and what's the just result. Without mass media, it doesn't happen in that way. Then we get to the digital world. This is sort of my version of it. And for some reason that I can't fully explain, the digital world seemed to overwhelm us, and we started thinking in terms of justice more about resolution. How do we, there's so much stuff now. How do we resolve the disputes? And resolution started becoming a bigger issue in terms of what justice is and in terms of practical implementations even in the law. Think of arbitration. Think of truth and reconciliation commissions as an example of the need for resolution. And this came, if you want to go, wasn't that long ago that what you were looking at was the Nuremberg trials as opposed to what Nelson Mandela instituted in South Africa in terms of openness and trying to reconcile horrible things. So it's an interesting transition. I mean, each one of these slides could be a book that I certainly am not qualified to write, but and now we get to big data, and we're much more interested in boundaries for good reason, because it's become about privacy. So again, look at how the media of communication influences our definitions of justice. Think of how differently we treat each other. How careful we are not to invade each other's space in certain ways. And then, I mean, you tell me, especially if you did Oculus last week, now what happens in a virtual reality world? I'm pretty sure that it's going to be about freedom of thought, which is beyond boundaries. It's actually, you will not mess with me. My mind is my mind. And I have a sacred right to it. All right. So with all of that, we were talking about chill. And we were talking about prior restraints. And what you just need to focus on is that we, and you've seen this slide before, but we have so many legal mechanisms to restrain creativity. So it's in that context that it should be no surprise, and it is all to the good, even in the Blizzard case, that creativity is the focal point. Because it's what truly sets games apart, and our kind of limited insight, I have no idea what that was, our limited insight is that creativity is not just about the developer or who we thought was the creator of the game, but also about the gamer who is a creator. So we've just widened the circle. And this is how it may fall into what I was just talking about, which is how which is how technology impacts our concepts of justice. And that is, creativity has been a prime mover in the democratization of thought throughout. So you could take, in fact, we're going to do it. I don't have a lot of time, but I want to do this. And I'm going to figure out a way of fixing this slide to show this. I want you to take this slide and I want you to put creativity down the center of all of these things. And you will see how well it relates. That it is very much why we keep evolving our technologies. Why do we do that? We do it because it gives us better creative tools. And now I can go through the rest of this incredibly quickly because you've seen much of it, but it's the basic argument, hopefully in a better context. Mods. And I got to point this out. You may think I took something. This was posted 3 weeks ago. There is a new track for Grand Prix Legends, which is a 14-year-old game. And new free track. So, and this is for a mod from Microsoft Flight Simulator. So, nothing new here. We stand in the world of mods in a place where, a far better place than we were. There still is the iRacing case, which is an obstacle. But ultimately, we're moving to a place where there's a good argument that modding should be a user's right and a user's creative right. Creativity and connection in gameplay is the core of the argument, and the player as a co-creator is the manifestation. So, the original puzzle, why do we do games? Arguably, it's mapped directly into our brain for whatever reason. And we've gone down that rabbit hole. We're not going to go down it again. We evolve through games in various ways. Our social structures are mapped in and by games. And games allow us to create, to give. This is the real meaning of Boyden. Somebody, and I loved it, somebody here referred to Boyden as a philosopher. I think this is where the philosophy lives. And that is that games allow us to provide meaning as gamers, as users. We'll leave post-structuralism to next week. It obviously fits into that. And what's our mechanism? Users' rights. Supreme Court of Canada. You've seen these quotes. You'll see them one more time. Fair dealing is a user's right. And the relevant perspective when considering whether the dealing is for an allowable purpose is that of the user. Take out the word user, insert the word gamer, insert the word modder, and you're good to go. Now, interesting point. We've raised it earlier in the course, so I can't resist focusing you on it. And it's really interesting that Justice Abella said in one of the pentology cases that, you know what, we don't have to focus on the aggregate amount of dealing when we're dealing with the user to give them rights. We don't have to say, gee, for them to have rights, they, the full amount of how much it's dealt with, of how much copyright material is dealt with, creates unfairness. Now, what's interesting is if you flip it into games, the amount of creativity that modders and users insert into the game in a Boyden context is larger in many cases, in probably most cases, than that of the developer. So what would Madam Justice Abella, who I think was trying to be kind to users, say about that? Because it is one of the arguments for modders' rights, for users' rights. I just want to point out that sometimes we should all be careful what we ask for, because that looks like a very liberal statement, but it can cut the other way in an interesting way. So what are the rationales for this? You know them all by now. Everything is connected. I want to do this one last thing before we go. And some of you will have heard this at the beginning, but I want to go to Springsteen, essentially to finish this up. 2640. And 2735 to 30. So this is Bruce Springsteen speaking at SXSW about what inspired him.
And it is a great honor and thrill for me to introduce the South by Southwest
and seeing that album cover really good beat groups. People tell me there ain't no sense in trying. My little girl, you're so young and pretty. One thing I know is true. You'll be dead before your time is due. This I know. See my daddy in bed and dying. See his hair turning gray. He's been working and slaving his life away. Yes, I know. It's been work every day. Just work every day. It's been work, 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 work. We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do, we gotta get out of this place. Girl, there's a better life for me and you. Yes, I know. That's every song I've ever written.
That was an Animals song.
Yeah. That's all of them. I'm not kidding either. That's Born to Run, Born in the USA. Everything I've done for the past 40 years, including all the new ones, you know. But that struck me so deep. It was the first time I felt I heard something come across the radio that mirrored my home life, my childhood. And the other thing that was great about the Animals was there were no good-looking members. There were none. They were considered to be one of the ugliest groups in all of rock and roll. And that was good. That was good for me because I considered myself hideous at the time. And so, okay, all right, you know. And they weren't nice, you know. They didn't curry favor. You know, they were like aggression personified. It's my life. I'll do what I want, you know. They were cruel. They were cruel, which was so freeing. It was so freeing.
I'll play you one last clip.
It's a hard world to get to bring all the good things have been taken. They'll make certain things. Though dressed in these rags, I'll wear sable someday. Hear what I say. I'm going to ride the serpent. No time spent sweating rent. You know. And then that beautiful, it's my life. You don't know what you want. Show me I'm wrong. Hurt me sometime. Hurt me sometime. But someday I'll treat you real fine. I love that. Yes, 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 yes. You know? And then they had the name. The name was very different from the Beatles or Herman's Hermits or Freddie and the Dreamers. You know, the name was unforgiving and final and irrevocable. It was in your face. It was the most unapologetic group name until the Sex Pistols came along. You know? Badlands, Prove It All Night. The darkness was filled with the Animals. You know, I took youngsters. Watch this one. All right, I took. I'm gonna tell you how it's done right now. I took. Don't Let Me Be Misunderstood. It's the same fucking riff, man. Listen up, youngsters. This is how successful theft is accomplished. All right? And I mean, darkness was also informed by the punk explosion at the time. I went out and I got all the records, all the early punk records, and I brought Anarchy and UK and God Save the Queen, and the Sex Pistols were so frightening. You know, they were, you know, they literally, they shook the earth. You know, they were truly, which is different from shocking. You know, a lot of groups managed shocking, but frightening was something else. There were very, very few rock groups that managed frightening. You know, and that was a great quality. It was part of their great beauty. You know, they were brave and they challenged you and they made you brave, and a lot of that energy seeped its way into the subtext of Darkness. Darkness was written in 1977, and all of that music was out there. And
All right. So the point of that is creativity and mods are completely interrelated. I mean, that's Springsteen modding other people's songs for creative purposes. It's kind of hard to argue against that. And that takes us back to, is there a game without a gamer? And this basic argument that the preponderance of creativities might just lie with the co-creators, with the gamers. And ultimately, philosophically, that creativity is more important than property. If you don't agree with that, you don't get Springsteen. So make your election. Another part of this that just we have to at least note for academic purposes is that there is an interpretation out there of intellectual property as neo-colonialism, and there's a fair bit of work done. And I've not done anything other than this to bring it up in this class. But there are some larger arguments about why traditional intellectual property perspectives shouldn't apply. So where does this all end up? At least for part A of our reconciliation, this ends up with the courts. And what will the courts do? This is a wonderful article by Rebecca Tushnet of Georgetown, worrying about what the United States Supreme Court is going to do to users' rights. And it's well worth us reflecting on the fact that we seem to be on far firmer ground in Canada and far more hopeful ground in Canada. Now, we haven't had a video game case go up to the Supreme Court of Canada, one that has to do with users' rights or modders' rights. But at least for today, at least here at the end of 2014, I like the chances. So next week, gonna look at a whole bunch of the issues that we've talked about in the course and hold them up against post-structurally informed legal concepts and see where we end up. And I'm going to talk about hardware. I'm going to talk about the connectivity of the platforms, because that's a missing piece and increasingly an important piece, as you saw last week. So we're going to take a quick break, still on that one, and we're going to have Adrian Crook join us and talk to us about the larger issues of the industry and where it's going. So just 2 minutes and we'll switch over. Okay, let's continue. So we have Adrian Crook here today. I've been impressed in a number of respects by work Adrian has done and wanted him to be part of this course. He is new to the course. We have sort of a couple of new speakers every year, and Adrian is one of them. So he'll tell you a little bit about himself and what he does for the industry, and is going to talk about where things are going and about anything he wants to talk about.
Cool. Yeah, that looked like a really interesting. Is this okay? Is this thing on now? This live?
Yeah, you should be on. Let me just make sure.
Make sure. No, I can hear.
Yeah, you're good.
You bet. Okay. That looked like an interesting talk. My son is heavily into, one of my sons, my oldest son, is into heavily modding Minecraft, so that's cool. I'll just skip to the next slide if this works. Forward, backwards, there we go. So I run a consultancy that specializes in game design. I started in the games industry in 1995 working for Electronic Arts Canada. I spent about 5 years there in a producer capacity. I've done a bunch of stuff since then. I had a public company for a while that raised a few $1 million and did like a PlayStation 2 title back when the PlayStation 2 was something. But now what we do is we consult for the likes of companies like those, like EA and Zynga and Ubisoft and Glue and most of the majors and some of the middle tier ones as well. So what we typically do is we'll come in and we'll take a look at a title that's underperforming, usually a mobile game, and we'll come up with design-oriented solutions to improve their KPIs, so key performance indicators. So, day 1, day 7, day 30 retention, all their monetization metrics, those sort of things. So it's a group of about a half a dozen of us. I mostly now manage the company. I used to be a one-man band. We've been in business for about 8 years now. So that's kind of what I do. Let's see. I don't think I missed anything. Basically what we do is we come in and we assess a title and work with that company over this course of a few months usually to improve it. So that's the perspective I come at the industry from, probably a producer and designer sort of perspective. Let's see, backwards, forwards. Has functionality ceased on this thing? There we go. Okay, we're going to quickly talk about the explosion in game reach and popularity, where the industry has been, and the new market forces that are sort of shaping it going forward. Some of this is going to be really, really basic. I wasn't sure of where this class was. I was really kind of impressed. I would have just hung out and watched this, actually. If I was...
These are law students. Okay. So we've been focusing on the law, and we have sprinkled in at various times over the semester perspectives from developers. Okay. But I would say that you are the first overview from someone who's really entrenched with the top level developers. So we've brought in Andy Moore, who speaks incredibly well from the indie perspective.
Yeah, super indie, yeah.
Yeah,
he lives like right across, I can see his building from mine. I live downtown.
So Andy is super indie, and that was a great introduction into the kind of creative forces. For sure. We've had people from EA in, but they've come from the legal side.
Oh, like EA legal people?
Yeah, so EA legal people at the beginning. So there's been some institutional, but not institutional creative. Oh, and that's what you really represent.
Okay, well, we'll see if I can get into some details there. Let's see, is this going to work? There we go. So again, business models, distribution, popular platforms, we'll cover this sort of stuff really quickly. I'll skip right through this because, well, actually, how old are most people in here? Some of this may actually not be basic to that. But, like growing up, obviously, the business model for packaged products was packaged products. There was no really online games when I was growing up. You went and bought it from a store. So this is where the business model is coming from, very much consumer packaged goods. Their CPG is the acronym for that, which is what the industry was entirely until... late 90s, early 2000s, maybe, somewhere around there, and which is really when a whole lot was disrupted. So that's physical, copies of games purchased from stores, basically. And as I just said, what changed everything was the net. And what was interesting is when that came along, like I had a growing interest in the net in like 95, 96, 97 when I started working at EA. And, that was sort of like a sideline. That was something that I made games in my full-time job, and then I was the guy that knew stuff about the web, like on my sideline. It was really cool when those started to come together, because then all of a sudden you could really see some really cool things happening. And when it really came together in terms of like free-to-play games in 2006, at least in North America, that was when both of my sort of passions collided. And that's pretty much, I'm taking a sidetrack, but that's what got me into consulting, because I was sort of at the forefront of that. So after the internet exploded, increased access to games, made piracy easier, but also promised an end to it with Steam. Smartphones became really popular probably in like 2007, I guess was when, that's when the initial iPhone launched. More people started playing games, so broadened the market. And new players meant there are different demands for different genres. And
of course, you haven't mentioned the Nokia N-Gage.
Yeah, well, I had a lot of friends who worked on that, so I luckily avoided working on that. I should have put an image of that up. So smartphones and tablets spawned like an even greater casual games market, but obviously entire mobile game market. The internet brought a casual game market that was mostly like those trial to purchase casual games. That's where that sort of started, at least, with what the internet was offering. And it also took games like that used to be played traditionally only in LAN parties and made them playable online. Like we used to play Command and Conquer at the EA office in 1995, and we'd come in on a Saturday to play that on the local network, and then all of a sudden you could play that with people around the world. So that was a big disruption.
People, and some of you will be old enough to remember this, but people used to lug around
that's right.
their full PCs.
To take our computers to somebody's house.
You would go to a LAN party, you would take your PC.
True.
And very heavy PC. We're not talking laptops.
Right.
You couldn't play games
Your
on
giant
laptops
desktop,
in those
yeah.
days. You take your desktop and your monitor and go to someone's house or go to a place of business that had a good network set up, plug in, and spend a day playing games.
So is that really where we're at age-wise in this room? Shoot. Oh, I'm so old. Okay. Because that just seems normal to me. Casual social games skyrocketed in popularity. I mentioned that before. Like the internet sort of introduced more people to games. Broadband net speeds started opening that up. And, there began to be a growing library of like middleware and tools that allowed let people to make games more easily. So where are we now? I don't know if you can see this super well, but it's a good slide to sort of illustrate just how much the industry has exploded. So maybe we can find where games used to be. Digital gaming, digital distribution, console developers, console publishers, console manufacturers. This used to be like almost the entirety of the game industry. There was a PC component in there as well, but in the 80s and 90s really, this was it. And now there's all this other stuff. So, most of our business, the company that I run now, is actually just this right here, mobile. We used to do a tiny bit of social too, but that social really meant Facebook, and we don't really do that anymore because not many of our clients are treating it as a primary platform. So there's still companies like Casual, which is like the trial to purchase casual games, or like the Mini Clips of the world, which are Flash games, and we're actually doing a development contract for that company right now. It's like an HTML5 game. But you can see like the industry as a whole is absolutely huge. You've got like a lot of different distribution methods on this side. You've got still the same physical, well, not really the same, but those are sort of the same, but some new physical distribution methods in here. A bunch of crazy digital distribution methods. A whole bunch of different sort of vectors of types of games, from core MMO sort of stuff to gamification, which we've never really dealt with because it's kind of a buzzword. Social, mobile, casual, and then all these sort of, like I mentioned before, middleware, development tools, analytics, so like figuring out what's going on with your game, using that type of information in marketing and design decisions, in-game advertising, payments and monetization, acquisition and player tools. It's an absolutely massive industry now.
And I just got to point out, this is an amazing slide and well worth, when we put it up, you going to. But one of the reasons you need to go to that slide is it is as good an index to who you might be applying for jobs to if you are interested in this area as I have ever seen, all in one place.
Yeah, of course I didn't make this.
Yeah, no.
Make that really, really clear. Yeah.
but it's quite a remarkable piece because Adrian's exactly right. This used to be the industry, and then there'd be maybe a couple of tool makers.
Sure.
There'd be one or two in each category, and this is what it's become, which is why you're getting these explosive growth figures, which are future slides of yours. So I won't go.
No worries. Like the kind of stuff that's really popular right now, like if you're looking at sort of opportunities, like really in-demand skill sets, anything to do with analytics, especially if you're somebody that comes at things from a numbers perspective and can take a look at, Contagion is like a middleware or a tool that goes in and you can sort of set it up to measure game events and figure out how many people are coming back on day 1, day 7, day 30, those sort of things, like how much they're spending. If you're somebody that can break down those numbers and then direct, say, a design person like myself as to, we can collaborate and figure out how to sort of increase that day 7 retention from 15% to 25%, then those are hugely in-demand skill sets. Whereas something like...
And from a lawyer perspective, that goes into privacy issues.
Oh, yeah.
So, being a privacy lawyer in this because they need
That's a
them.
good point. Yeah, yeah. As a game designer, privacy, whatever. Let's see. Payments and monetization, hugely competitive and almost like commodity level now. It's like, at least if you're getting into that business, it's brutally competitive and not looked upon terribly favorably by the rest of the creatives in the industry or whatever. I could spend forever just talking about this slide, so I don't want to take too long on it. But any questions about that quickly before we move on? Nothing? Okay, so just really, really broadly, where we're at now is sort of two different business models. This is super 50,000-foot view. Premium used to be the entire market, pay up front, then get the game. Freemium is now, everyone knows what freemium is. I don't need to explain it. So a quick comparison of then and now. Then small audience, mostly hardcores, Fox sales, pay with it out of your wallet or whatever. And only single players, and there was geographically limited multiplayer, lugging your computer, and then everyone sort of understands where we are today. You're playing with everyone in the world, tons of different platforms, tons of different payments methods, a very broad market, and lots of different ways to pay. And then we've got some variations on premium and freemium, at least in mobile social games. Anyone not familiar with any of these? Maybe these deserve some explanation.
I think you should talk about DLC.
Yeah, sure.
We haven't talked about DLC. We haven't talked about gated progression, and I don't know what MTX and premium is. So.
Yeah, maybe these are some of my own. The problem is there's a lot of different jargon in game development, and you'll get I didn't even know what MTX was until I started working with EA on Scrabble. I was doing product management on Scrabble in 2012, and they called IAP or microtransactions or so many other words for it. They call it MTX and microtransactions.
Oh, okay.
So whatever. So basically, there are a couple different premium there's a premium model that is episodic. So all the Traveler's Tales games, basically, or Walking Dead. That sort of pay for every single episode that comes out. There's a subscription model in premium that could apply to MMOs, to really anything where you charge a recurring subscription. In freemium, there's obviously ad support and virtual items. Those are the two major models in freemium. These hybrid models, I put Infinity Blade up here because Infinity Blade is MTX and premium, basically. So that was a $6.99 title, I think. It was this premium purchase price, and then you'd buy stuff. There was an MTX model or microtransactions or IAP model within that. Gated progression would be a freemium title where at some point you just run up against a wall and you've got to pay to get past it. And DLC that's a bit tougher. It's more of a term used in console land. It's just, it's the very first piece of DLC was the horse armor in Oblivion or something.
Yeah.
Remember?
Or Forza.
Really, now it's anything where you're buying something off that.
You get car packs or whatever.
Yeah.
I've got one question for you. It's now gotten, and this is obviously the time to raise it for those of you who are gamers, it's now gotten to the point where there is an annual Call of Duty game, and there's an annual Assassin's Creed game, and they are really part of a series of games. Has the industry called that a model or see that as a model? Because it's not on here, to all the world, it's just another premium game. But at this point, they're being scheduled 3, 4, 5 years in advance.
That's all it is. It's an annual franchise, and the way somebody in the Call of Duty case, the way they do that, or the way they used to do it, I'm sure they'd still do it this way, is two different developers that are each taking 2 years to release a title, right? So it'd be very hard to develop something like, Advanced Warfare on a yearly basis, but if you've got two different developers, then you can stagger them, and that's what they're doing. And obviously, from a shareholder perspective, you want that type of consistent revenue, especially with what I'll explain later, what's happening in the console game world. But I'll try to
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, so freemium is a radical change. So I thought about this a tiny bit, and basically freemium is to games as SaaS is to enterprise. So I mean, it's software as a service, right? So we were used to developing packaged product, games where we just basically put it out and somebody else would market it in a store, a physical store, and we're done. And now what we're doing with games is we make it, and that's sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's we spend 10% of the budget making it, and the other 90% of it sort of maintaining it, growing it over the next months or years, hopefully. So it's much more of a software as a service sort of model, at least in freemium, than it used to be. We never had that sort of problem before. So let's see. Then I see a lot of I wouldn't say our clients, but and I'll see this is being recorded, so let's see. What can I say? I see a lot of people, developers, who basically fail to gauge that complexity level of operating a live game. So they put all their effort into making a game, they launch it, they hope within the first month or two they start seeing revenue so they can keep the lights on, basically, and they don't, and they go out of business. So there's I know one person in New York personally who makes a business basically salvaging games. So games where a developer just sort of sputters out of cash, he can come in, and if the metrics look okay, halfway decent, he can, buy it for a song, basically, take it over and retool it, and now, he has a game that he can operate on like himself.
And the monthly maintenance costs for a game that's all online is pretty significant.
It can be. It depends what kind of game it is and how it's architected. But I mean, these days with like the Amazon clouds, sort of system for hosting, like deploying content and hosting games and that sort of stuff. It depends. Like, if you're deploying a lot of like rich content, it can get expensive. But if you're just hosting a database that's been architected okay, then you're probably fine. The problem comes in mostly it's the cost of marketing. It's the cost of user acquisition, which is what sinks people, because they kind of believe that everyone will just tell their friends and all of a sudden they'll have 1 million users, when really you need to actually seed that market a bit by paying for users. And there's, from your perspective, the legal issues around sunsetting freemium games are something that's still sort of shaking out. So I was just talking to a friend yesterday who works at a large mobile game developer downtown, and they had just, again, what can I say? Well, they had run a sale recently in a game, and then they were, a couple months later, I guess, they had announced to the player base that they were shutting that game down. So a bunch of people that bought virtual items in that game are pretty upset now, because they were given a few months warning. Like, so let's say they announced last week that they're going to shut down the game in a few months, but 2 months ago they sold them a bunch of items at full price around a certain promotion. So this is coming up a lot, this idea that I bought a bunch of virtual property and now you're taking my game away, you're closing it because it no longer meets the minimum profitability threshold for you. What do I get? I bought those items expecting that I own them. So sort of basic stuff, bunch of new digital distribution platforms, a lot of issues around discovery, like discovering games because they're so crowded. And then it goes too fast.
Yes.
Okay.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, we've got a bunch of emerging, some, platforms that have been around for a while. Some platforms that are maybe less in vogue than they used to be. Some platforms that are really less in vogue than they used to be. Handheld is almost dead now due to mobile and tablets. And then like some that are really emergent, where if you want to blow a lot of money, you can do it very easily. Virtual reality.
We had an Oculus class last week. Yes.
Oh, okay.
7 students took the class
cool.
in another room on Oculus, so
neat.
they're somewhat acquainted with the emergent. I've got a question that I'm just really curious about, and I think people in the class certainly remember this. Facebook games were really, really huge, and they made Zynga. They made Farmville, and they are nowhere now.
Yeah.
And it's not been that long ago.
No, it isn't. Yeah.
What happened? No one's ever. I have yet to see an article, and maybe I've just missed it. That dissected for me what happened to the phenomenon that was Facebook games.
Well, I have a slide that deals with that.
I
added since, so maybe I'll wait until we get to that, because that's a really good question. This is just how the market breaks out between the different types of games. So casual web games, mobile phone games, mid-core PC Mac games, MMO games, tablet games, handheld games, TV console games. So you can basically see that, even though consoles are sort of often derided as being passé, they still occupy a huge portion of the market, 29% And mobile is like huge and growing all the time. So at 19%, this is, it says 2014. I'm not sure at what point this year it was done. I mean, Google image search is my best friend these days. So,
and PC
I'm not sure.
is huge.
PC is huge, and it's growing at the expense of console to some degree. So, and I think I mentioned that in here, the next slide or something.
Yeah, and I had a real question about that slide, but introduce this slide, and then I'll ask you my question.
No, there's not much to say in this slide, and this slide is a bit old. So again, Google image search, I blame. But you can see console kind of dipping, but that's obviously in advance of new console releases coming in, so it's a bit unfair. But nonetheless, PC, driven mostly by Steam, is ascendant, and it's running into a lot of the same issues now that the mobile app stores are facing, so just discovery problems. So before you could put a game on Steam and reasonably expect that, because there's a very well moneyed, passionate user base behind Steam, that if you deliver something in their wheelhouse, you'll do quite well. Now the amount of new titles on Steam is increasing dramatically all the time, and now we're getting into discovery problems that mobile suffered from for at least the last 2 or 3 years.
Have consoles recovered and gone ahead of PC now that we're in the new generation? Because this was 2012.
I don't think so. I would bet not. And I tried to find a slide that was more recent than that. Unfortunately, I couldn't. But I would bet not.
Okay.
Consoles are not dying by any stretch of the imagination. But what is happening on consoles is consolidation. So I cover this in a slide that's coming up. But there you go, console product consolidation. So there are fewer and fewer big budget games able to be made. So I don't know, for any of you that have been around as long as we have, what happens is every successive console generation, the development costs doubled or tripled. So you wound up, like when I started developing games, some of the first games I worked on were like Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis. This is how old I am. So those budgets were like a few $100,000. And by the time I started like actually designing my own games, which was PlayStation 1, let's say, those budgets were $1.6 million we spent on one game and $2.1 million we spent on another game. And I was like, wow, this is the big time. And then I think the last major console product I produced myself was a $10 million project. It was an Xbox 360 launch title, and I was like, wow, it's huge. But even still, that wasn't as big as most, some of my friends were working on $40 million titles at that point. Now, some of my friends are like producers on, say, Destiny, or like, and a lot of my friends work at Blizzard now. So those budgets are hundreds of millions of dollars. So you can't make a failed bet at that level and expect your company to survive. So as a result, you get a lot of consolidation going on. So these titles are what you just sort of double down on, and all the smaller titles and all the smaller publishers or mid-sized publishers, they go away, and they choose safer lines of work or safer products entirely.
And the only original IP in those three that isn't a follow-up is Destiny, and Destiny is done by the people who did Halo, so it's in a special category.
They weren't exactly out of left field.
Yeah, so you're not seeing a whole. This happened in Hollywood. This happened in television for many years. As the industry gets bigger, as the bets get bigger, the original stories become fewer.
That's exactly right. Yeah, in TV, eventually you get like those like subscription cable sort of things that came on and were able to invest in, more original narrative-driven content.
So to tie this into the first part of today's class, there's another argument why it's important to have indies, to have mods, to have gamers and users who are making creative contributions, because the original storytelling is in a fairly narrow band at the top if that's all you can have.
Yeah, exactly. I've just blasted through these slides. GTA was the fastest entertainment property to reach $1 billion in sales. Did it in 3 days, GTA 5. And that's including movies. Most expensive game ever, but that's probably wrong, because Destiny was rumored to have cost $500 million. It didn't, but it's probably at least 300. I know the dev costs on Destiny were around, I can't really say.
The Old Republic was $200 million?
I didn't make this slide. Lame Mashable, but yeah, they're probably, I think they're including marketing, including dev and marketing costs, so that's why. This is just another slide to show what's happening on the mobile side, you've got an extremely fragmented platform landscape. So this, you can't read this, but this is a slightly older slide. But Samsung Galaxy S3, the Galaxy S2, S4, Note 2. Like, so when we develop games, we basically develop them for kind of this box here. And then all the rest of this, you just kind of hope and pray it works for, from like a screen resolution perspective and a performance perspective. And that's why Android as a platform is behind iOS, is because from a developer perspective, it's way, way harder. iOS is fragmenting a tiny bit, but nowhere near this level. And as much as there's fragmentation on the hardware side of Android, there's fragmentation on the on the operating system, on the firmware side of Android. So, when you get a new iOS update, you get it almost right away. Like most people, within a week, about 80% of of Apple owners have the new iOS. The same thing is not true on Android. So it's a much harder platform to address for developers.
And from a legal perspective, I don't want to say it's hotly contested, but one of the more challenging parts of the negotiation that you will have is on what's going to be tested, whether you're acting for the developer or you're acting for whoever is funding the game and the distributor. It's, what are the top, what are the 10 platforms that the developer is going to do testing on and is responsible to provide a working game for.
Yeah.
And it's very tricky, and it changes from contract to contract,
It does, yeah.
and very often the distributor who's funding part of the game changes their mind, or there are technological changes, or new platforms coming up, and it's tricky. I don't want to say it's difficult. It's tricky because it's a moving target.
Well, and if you're the publisher paying a developer to make this game, you're obviously going to try to include as much of this as humanly possible because that's your addressable market and what you want that developer to support. But I'm usually coming at this from the development perspective, the game that we've just finished working on, and we try to whittle this down as much as possible.
And there's only so much you can do.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And some of these things, like we were trying to support iPad 2 for an HTML5 game, and iPad 2 is now pretty old hardware, and HTML5 doesn't run super well on that. So we would have spent, like, I would say 30% of one resource's time just working on iPad 2 support, which has a real cost to us that if we had a better lawyer, maybe he would have knocked that off the list before we even get started. Quick demographics of gamers, ignore that. I don't know why they differentiated between next-gen gamers and console gamers. It's the same thing. But really the major thing here is there's slightly more females in mobile games than there are in console games, which surprises no one.
Why do the latest figures, and there's recent articles, and maybe this is an older slide, say there are more women than men even playing PC games, including
Does it make a good headline? I don't think anyone realistically believes that. I mean, in certain genres, absolutely, but I don't think you could absolutely say that there are more women playing games than men across the board.
Anyways, there are PC gamer articles. There's stuff that I've posted online, and it's just interesting that there's a discrepancy on the numbers.
Like if you really stretch gaming and cover a lot of casual gaming, and then cover a lot of the casual game genres that women are more predominant in than men, then I guess you could get there, but
okay,
I think it makes a great headline, though. Let's see, rise of new market forces. Okay, so lower barrier to entry into industry. I need to blast through this as we're a little bit behind, but so there's a lot more things like middleware, like Unity, that allows us to make games to address multiple platforms at once. So it's easier to develop games now, and these engines are lower cost than ever. It used to be something like Unreal would cost you $1 million to license. I don't know if they charge still $1 million for their console license. I doubt it. But now they have, like, I think a next to free or nearly free mobile option as well. Unreal does. So.
And the way it works is you pay when your game is sold. You're paying a percentage over to your tool developer, if you will.
Yeah, which is
far more friendly model to developers and indies especially.
Yeah, like an EA would never go for it. EA doesn't give up points on the back end like very easily unless you're like John Madden or somebody else that is on the cover of their box. But like, Joe Schmo that's just starting up in their basement, they don't care if they're...
It's a good deal for them, in fact.
Yeah, exactly. You know, and there are things like crowdfunding coming into play, at least in games. There's some debate whether or not Kickstarter is still viable for crowdfunding games, but I think it is. It really depends on, like, if you know what type of game Kickstarter backers like to fund on Kickstarter, then you can really zero in on that. Like a local game, what was it? Tyler Sigmund's game, Darkest Dungeon.
Yeah.
Did quite well, raising, how much did they raise? A few $100,000 or something on Kickstarter just recently. And then equity crowdfunding as well is something that's just coming online in Canada. So the idea that I can contribute and get, you know, a little tiny percentage of equity in the company or the project that I'm funding, that I guess has its own legal issues that are.
It does.
Okay.
Securities law issues that we don't deal with here.
Ah, good. All right, never mind. And then there are a lot of different player participation avenues into games these days that didn't used to exist. So things like esports, or, you know, the guy that's making $800,000 a year streaming his League of Legends play over Twitch TV for, I can't remember what company signed him up to do that. And then creating and selling game mods and content. And we have games that help players make games. That's kind of a, you know, other things that are sort of contributing to growth, growth of the internet, cloud gaming, all the legal problems around that, regulation, security, net neutrality, growth of mobile. There's still lots of growth left in mobile. There's people coming online, mostly in like BRIC nations, like you know, non-Western world sort of nations, where there's probably like mid to lower end mobile handsets, which are still really powerful. That'll be coming online, so that's a huge addressable market that'll probably require different types of games than we're used to seeing here, but still very viable games, and different payment methods as well, probably. So that's all created a crowded market. And when you get a crowded market, it costs more to get customers, and that's what's happened. And this is a slightly old slide, but I have a feeling that just continues doing this. So this green line is ARPU, like average revenue per user, which is relatively stable. But then the cost of acquiring that user just goes up and up and up. And that's what happens in crowded markets, is that it just gets more competitive and more expensive to address your consumers. And then what happens eventually is that average revenue per user, or another metric is LTV, lifetime value of a particular user. So if a user stays in your product for 6 months and every month he spends $20, let's say, a paying user, his LTV would be like $120, I guess. So what you want to do is, for every one of those paying users you acquire, you don't want to have spent more than the LTV of that paying user. So I was visiting a developer in Bangkok last summer, and they were telling me, I have to like do this properly for the cameras, so I'm not giving away anything, but they were telling me that they're spending like $10 to acquire each user, and only one out of every 22 users monetizes. So then they're spending $220 to acquire one monetizing user. So if and I can't say what genre of game this is, but it's a fairly casual mobile game. So then you've got to think that, is your lifetime value of a paying user more than $200 some odd in that particular game type? And the answer for them was no. And their user acquisition costs were so high because a particular company, King.com, had just raised several $1 billion in the public markets, and had bid up user acquisition costs in their particular genre so much that they just had to sit on the sidelines, as they put it, until those acquisition costs came back down after maybe that company spends their way out.
What goes into user acquisition costs? It's marketing, but what else is in there? That, like, what would King do that would bring in?
Well, it's really, all it is like, it's just an open market. So, there are user, I could go back to that other slide that had advertising.
Right.
There was that advertising sort of segment down here, companies like